Street Mildred's church had always been the pride of the village of Elmswood. It stood atop a gentle rise, its spire visible from nearly every cottage lane. On late autumn mornings, the bell chimes drifted over fields of pale mist and grazing sheep, as comforting and familiar as one's own heartbeat. On that particular Saturday, the churchyard hummed with cheerful activity. The annual harvest luncheon was a tradition cherished for nearly a century. The tables were laid with embroidered cloths, steaming dishes of roasted vegetables, meat pies, apple tarts, plum preserves, and bread so warm that butter sank into their crusts like melting snow. Village folk gathered in their usual arrangements, ladies by the serving tables exchanging gentle opinions on recipes, the men discussing hedge trimming and parish finances, and the younger ones trying and failing to look bored with rural life. Miss Jane Marple was seated near the parish garden wall, wrapped in a pale lavender shawl. Her knitting needles clicked in a softly rhythmic fashion. She was not knitting anything in particular, at least, not that she admitted, but she always insisted the movement helped the mind stay tidy. Those who knew her well recognized that Miss Marple was listening, quietly, always. The vicar, Reverend Lionel Pemberton, looked particularly spirited that afternoon, bustling from one table to the next with an almost theatrical joy. His voice carried easily over the crowd, especially when he spoke of the church's newest accomplishment. "Ah, yes, we mustn't forget our highlight," he said, gesturing toward the church doors, where a gleaming brass plaque had been newly affixed. "We have finally restored the old organ. Beautifully done, beautifully tuned. A marvelous donation from our dear benefactor, Mr. Edgar Selby. Let us hope we shall hear it played tomorrow during morning service." At the mention of Edgar Selby, several heads turned. Mr. Selby, a tall, silver-haired gentleman with a dignified posture and a taste for tailored suits, stood separate from the crowd as though already carved into memory rather than part of the present moment. He nodded politely at the acknowledgement, offering a thin, reserved smile. His family had owned Selby Manor on the hill for generations, but the Selby lineage, once admired, had gathered whispers in recent years: debts, disputes over property, and a quiet tragedy involving a nephew who had left Elmswood and never returned. If Selby heard any of the murmured gossip around him, he gave no sign. Just then, a sudden flutter of agitation stirred by the tables. Mrs. Clara Hensworth, a rounded woman with a pleasant face and an unfortunate tendency toward breathlessness, was pushing her way through the crowd carrying a dish covered in embroidered linen. "Do set it down, Clara," urged Mrs. Golding, who disliked fuss. But Mrs. Hensworth seemed rattled. Her cheeks were pale, and her hands trembled. "It's nothing at all," she said, forcing a smile that convinced no one. Miss Marple, without looking up from her knitting, murmured to the woman beside her. "Clara's had a shock. Something she's seen or heard. Notice the way her hands twitch rather than shake. That is a sign of fear rather than illness." Before her companion could respond, a sharp, sudden sound echoed from inside the church. A single, resounding note from the organ. It rang out pure, chilling, then dissolved into silence. Conversation halted mid-sentence. Heads turned. Even the children froze like startled birds. The Reverend blinked, startled. Good heavens! I thought the organist had not yet arrived. He hurried toward the church doors. Miss Marple set her knitting aside. She did not hurry. She never hurried. The villagers gathered behind the Reverend, each step echoing off the stone floor as they entered the dim interior. Soft beams of colored light filtered down from the stained glass windows, casting jewel-toned shadows across the pews. The organ stood at the front, as impressive as a cathedral relic, tall wooden casing, pipes reaching upward like solemn silver towers. And there, slumped over the organ bench, was a man. His head was bowed, his hands resting strangely at his sides. One shoe was slightly untied. A dark stain had spread across his waistcoat. "Mrs. Whitaker gasped. Someone cried out for the doctor. Reverend Pemberton staggered backward, hand flying to his mouth. Miss Marple stepped forward, her expression composed but grave. The man was Edgar Selby, dead, his body slanted awkwardly, as if he had attempted to rise or resist in his final moments. A murmur spread through the church like a sudden chill. Murder? No, surely not. It must have been his heart. But Miss Marple's eyes were fixed not on the wound, not on the stillness of the body, but on a small detail, a faint smear of blue chalk dust, trailing from Selby's fingers to the side of the organ. Unusual, purposeful, out of place. She whispered so softly that only she could hear it. "Now, what were you trying to tell us, dear Mr. Selby?" From behind her, Clara Hensworth let out a sob, the kind that sounded like a secret breaking, and the harvest luncheon, once cheerful and bright, dissolved into an afternoon of whispered fears and rising shadows beneath the church organ pipes. The church felt colder now, though no door or window had been opened. A hush had settled over the gathered villagers, as if the ancient stone walls themselves were holding their breath. Reverend Pemberton was speaking in low, trembling tones with Dr. Evans, who had examined Selby's body with the brisk, practical movements of a man accustomed to misfortune but never resigned to it. "Not a heart attack," Dr. Evans murmured finally, shaking his head. "No, not that. There's bruising here. Some manner of struggle, I'd say. Subtle, but clear enough. And the wound blade work. Quick, deliberate." The Reverend looked genuinely shaken. "In the church. Good Lord. In the church." One of the choir boys, a small freckled lad with wide eyes, began to cry softly. Someone ushered him outside into the autumn light. Miss Marple remained near the organ, her gaze not on Selby's face, nor even the wound, but the faint streak of blue chalk dust. She watched, calmly, as the villagers whispered hypotheses in agitated clusters. She did not interrupt. People reveal more truth when they are speaking to one another, not being questioned. Clara Hensworth had seated herself in the second pew, her shoulders trembling beneath her shawl. Her earlier distress now seemed far more significant. Miss Marple noted the way Clara's hands gripped the pew rail, fingers pressed inward, knuckles pale, but the shoulders angled slightly away from the body, as if guarding something fear, perhaps, or guilt by association rather than deed. Miss Marple sat beside her, slowly, without ceremony. "My dear," she said softly, hands folded. "You already knew something was wrong before we entered the church. I wonder what gave it away." Clara's breath caught. She didn't answer at first. I didn't know," she whispered, though her voice lacked conviction. Well, Mrs. Whitaker mentioned seeing Mr. Selby going inside earlier, and he looked pale, strange, and there was an argument. Yesterday, near the post office. Her eyes flicked nervously toward the church door, as though expecting someone to appear in the frame. Miss Marple did not try to soothe her. Comfort clouds clarity. "An argument?" she repeated gently. "With whom?" Clara swallowed. "With Arthur Pritchard. You know how Arthur is. Quick temper. And Mr. Selby, well, he can be rather proud. Something about a debt unpaid. That's what I heard. Though one never really knows what is true in a village. Does one?" Miss Marple gave a faint, knowing smile. "Oh, one does know, dear. One simply has to listen properly." Before Clara could answer, a heavy, purposeful tread echoed from the church entrance. Detective Inspector Gavin Harrow arrived with a pair of constables, his presence shifting the atmosphere at once. Harrow was a practical man, square-shouldered, his expression fixed in that firm neutrality of someone determined not to be misled by the dramatics of civilian tongues. He nodded politely to the Reverend, briskly introduced himself to those nearest, and moved directly to the organ. "We'll need to clear the church," he announced, "all except the Reverend and Dr. Evans. Statements will be taken shortly. Please wait outside in an orderly fashion." The villagers, never capable of an orderly anything when gossip was involved, moved in a flurry of whispers. Miss Marple stood too, though without haste. Harrow's eyes met hers as she passed. "Ah, Miss Marple," he said, with a touch of weary respect. "I should have known you'd already be here." She smiled mildly. "One does rather tend to be where one is needed. I suppose you've already formed an opinion?" he asked, half joking. "Oh no," she replied pleasantly. "Not an opinion, merely a question. And that is—" Miss Marple looked briefly toward the organ pipes, where the faintest trace of blue still clung in a streak. "Why chalk?" she said softly. "And why there?" Harrow blinked, glanced, and frowned. He had not yet noticed it. Before he could ask her more, a constable called him over to assist. Miss Marple walked out into the sharp autumn sunlight, where clusters of villagers stood in uneasy circles. Conversations paused as she passed, not from fear or reverence, but from the quiet understanding that Miss Marple rarely walked without direction. Arthur Pritchard stood leaning against the low stone wall of the churchyard, jaw clenched, arms folded too tightly to be comfortable. His eyes were fixed on the church door, but when he saw Miss Marple approaching, he quickly straightened. "Terrible business," he said, voice strained and slightly defensive before she had even spoken. "Yes," said Miss Marple, her tone as gentle as warm tea. "And so soon after your disagreement with him, it must feel quite dreadful for you." Arthur stiffened. I mean, people talk, Miss Marple, and they twist things. A disagreement doesn't make a murderer." "No," Miss Marple agreed, watching him with the faintest tilt of her head. "But fear sometimes does, or secrets, or desperation, and there is always a reason someone chooses to kill in a church rather than anywhere else." Miss Marple offered a polite, grandmotherly smile. "Do take care what you say today, Mr. Pritchard. The truth has a way of rising where the walls are oldest." She walked on, leaving him pale and shaken. Behind her, Detective Harrow emerged from the church, gaze scanning the crowd, expression now deeply troubled, because something inside that church had already confirmed what Miss Marple suspected. This murder was not a sudden act of rage. It had been prepared, planned, and Mr. Selby, before he died, had tried to leave behind a message. The constables ushered the villagers toward the church hall, where tea was being hastily prepared, though hardly anyone was thinking of tea. Voices rose and fell in uneasy murmurs. Every face carried the same question, but no one wanted to be the first to speak it aloud. Murder changed the air of a place. It settled into corners and clung to silences. Miss Marple sat at a small side table, where the sunlight spilled in through lace curtains. The warmth did little to distract from the subtle tension that threaded through the room. She placed her knitting bag beside her and folded her hands, observing. Arthur Pritchard had not followed the others inside. He lingered outside, still pacing now, and that was telling. A guilty man makes himself scarce, but an innocent man tries not to look like he's hiding. Arthur was doing both. Across the room, Clara Hensworth sat alone, twisting a handkerchief in small, tight knots. Her breathing had steadied, but her eyes darted from person to person, as if expecting someone to accuse her at any moment. Miss Marple watched the way she avoided looking toward the churchyard. A woman avoiding a sight is often avoiding a memory. Detective Inspector Harrow entered then, brushing a trace of dust from his coat sleeve. He surveyed the room with the air of someone already weary of everyone in it. When his gaze passed over Miss Marple, he hesitated only a moment before walking toward her. "You noticed the chalk," he said without preamble, lowering his voice as he sat. "We found more of it, under Selby's fingernails, and on the inside of the organ casing. Hidden, not visible unless you were looking for it." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "A message, then." He was trying to say something in his final moments. "Or someone tried to plant it," Harrow countered. "Perhaps," Miss Marple said mildly. "But blue chalk is not a common thing to have in one's pockets. Not unless one teaches school, or plays billiards, or handles the marking of parish ledger boards." Her eyes drifted toward the far end of the hall. Reverend Pemberton stood there, wringing his hands as he attempted to console a parishioner. The Reverend, who had keys to every part of the church, even the old storage loft, where unused items accumulated year after year. Harrow followed her gaze and frowned. "You're suggesting the Reverend could be involved?" "Not at all," Miss Marple replied in her warm, grandmotherly voice. "I am merely observing that the organ loft has chalk lines marking the repair beam's work from when the pipes were last restored." Restoration, did he not? Harrow blinked. Yes, a few months ago. He oversaw every detail. "Wanted the organ back to its former glory," he said. "And who performed the repairs?" "Local carpenter. Works out of his cottage behind the mill." Harrow paused, thinking. He was at the luncheon earlier. He left before the discovery. Miss Marple nodded once, as though confirming a thought she already held. A man who leaves early from a gathering he usually attends late into the afternoon. Unusual behavior, unless prompted by distress or urgency. The inspector exhaled softly, the first sign that her quiet deductions had begun to shape his thinking. Before either of them could continue, the church hall door swung open with a dull wooden thud. Harold Baines himself stood in the doorway, his expression drawn tight, eyes raw as if he had been crying. His clothes bore a thin dusting of sawdust, and just visible along his cuffs a faint smear of the blue. The room hushed. His voice came out strained and low. "Inspector, I need to speak with you." Harrow rose at once, but Harold lifted a shaking hand. "No, all of you should hear," he said, louder now, though his voice trembled at the edge. "I have something I must say, about Mr. Selby, and about what happened in that church." Miss Marple's knitting needles were motionless now. The room leaned forward, breath suspended. Harold swallowed. "It wasn't just a restoration," he said. "The organ Selby found something inside it, something hidden, something that was never meant to be found." A ripple of shock passed through the hall, but Miss Marple simply closed her eyes, very briefly. Not surprise, recognition. Secrets, after all, are never buried as deeply as the people who make them hope they are. A tension settled over the room so deeply that even the clinking of a spoon against china seemed intrusive. Harold Baines stood rigidly in the doorway, his breath uneven, like a man forcing himself to speak before courage dissolved again. "What was found?" Harrow said carefully, stepping just close enough to show attention without pressure. "Inside the organ." Harold's eyes flicked toward the church as if the organ itself might be listening. "A letter," he said, "hidden inside the upper casing, behind the far left pipe, sealed in oilcloth. Old, very old." The room absorbed this in a single silent inhale. "Mr. Selby made me tear apart half the organ just to reach it," Harold went on. "Said it had been left there during the war. Said it was meant for his father or his grandfather. Something about inheritance and property lines and promises." His hands opened and closed at his sides, as though recalling the effort of prying open ancient wood. He was different after he read it, quieter, but determined. He said he needed to set things right in the village. He said some people weren't going to be happy. Miss Marple's eyes moved softly, taking in the shifting expressions throughout the room, some startled, some anxious, others calculating. The history of a village lives in its people, she had always believed, and history, when threatened, becomes dangerous. Harrow said, "Where is this letter now?" Harold's throat tightened. "I don't know. He took it with him when he left the workshop that day. I never saw it again." Several voices rose at once, accusations, doubts, fearful speculation. Harrow lifted a hand, silencing them with firm authority, but Harold spoke again before order had fully returned. "And there's something more." His voice wavered. "The chalk. That chalk wasn't mine. Not that color. The only place I've seen blue chalk like that is—" His gaze drifted toward the rear of the hall. Everyone followed it, to Samuel Pierce, the church organist. Samuel sat stiffly, his polished shoes rooted to the floor, hands clasped too tightly in his lap. He was a quiet man of middle years, mild-spoken and habitually overlooked. He often walked the village lanes, humming soft hymn melodies, and no one ever imagined he might be capable of anything dramatic. Yet his face now had the look of someone who had rehearsed answers in his mind and suddenly feared those answers would not hold. "The chalk," Harold continued slowly, "is used to mark the tuning points on the pipes. Samuel uses it every week, keeps a box of it in the vestry drawer." Samuel's jaw tightened. "That proves nothing," he said, though his voice came out thinner than usual. "Half the choir comes in and out of that room. Anyone could have used it." "Anyone?" "Yes," Miss Marple said gently, her tone calm and deliberate. "But not everyone knows how to remove the organ casing quickly and quietly. That requires familiarity and confidence one wouldn't be disturbed. Only someone who felt they belonged there." The words were not accusatory, they were observational, which was far more unsettling. Samuel's composure faltered for a fraction of a second, and it was enough for the whole room to feel the shift. Harrow straightened, focusing in. "Mr. Pierce, where were you during the luncheon?" Samuel swallowed. "I stepped out. I needed to tune the organ before tomorrow's service." "During the luncheon?" Harrow asked, voice pitched low. Samuel's silence answered for him. Clara Hensworth's hand flew to her mouth. Harold took a step back, as if absorbing the realization physically. Miss Marple, meanwhile, simply studied Samuel's face not with suspicion, but with understanding, as if watching someone walking toward a truth they had tried desperately not to speak. Samuel's next words were ragged. Mr. Selby was going to expose something. His eyes darted toward the floor. Something that should have stayed buried. If he forced it into the open, people would have been ruined, lives destroyed. He didn't understand what he was undoing, and so you killed him. Someone whispered from the back. Samuel shook his head sharply. "No, I didn't touch him. I swear it. I argued with him, yes, but I left him alive. He was sitting at the organ when I came in. I tried to reason with him. I begged him. He said the truth needed to be known, no matter the cost." His voice trembled, then steadied with something like sorrow. "He said the letter would be read publicly at tomorrow's service." A stunned silence flowed through the hall. It was Miss Marple who finally broke it, softly, thoughtfully. And someone else in this village believed that truth was worth killing for. Her gaze drifted, not accusing, not searching, but knowing across the faces of the room. Someone flinched, but only Miss Marple noticed. The flinch lasted no longer than a blink, a tiny tightening of the shoulders and a quick downward flick of the eyes. A careful observer might have missed it amid the shifting bodies and murmuring breath of the hall. But Miss Marple was not a casual observer. She did not look directly at the person. To do so would be to alert them. Instead, she allowed her gaze to drift softly to the window, her face thoughtful, serene, almost distracted. But her mind, neat and methodical, filed the reaction away. Someone was afraid the letter would be found. Detective Harrow cleared his throat, drawing the room's attention back to him. "Samuel Pierce," he said, voice measured, "you will remain in town until this is resolved. Do not leave Elmswood. I'll need a formal statement from you." Samuel nodded once, relief and misery tangled together. He was shaken, not evasive, guilty of secrets, perhaps, but not murder. At least, Miss Marple thought. Not this one. Clara Hensworth rose unsteadily from her seat. "Inspector," she said, voice wavering, "you must understand. If there truly was a letter detailing village land claims, some of those deeds go back generations. Entire families could lose what they've built. People would panic." Miss Marple regarded her with a gentle sadness. Fear of loss, she knew, could make ordinary people behave in extraordinary ways. "Yes, Clara," she said softly, "which is precisely why someone acted swiftly, before Selby could speak, and before tomorrow's service." Harrow rubbed his brow. "We need that letter. Without it, we're chasing shadows. If someone took it from him after the murder, it could already be gone." Miss Marple lifted her knitting bag into her lap, smoothing the fabric. "Oh no," she said quietly. "Not gone. Hidden somewhere close. A murderer acts in haste, but hiding is done in panic. Explanations are most effective when the mind is already prepared to receive them." Instead, she turned her attention back to Harold Baines, whose gaze had fallen to the floor. "Mr. Baines," she said kindly, "you mentioned that Mr. Selby was determined to restore the organ to its exact former state. That seems particular. Did he explain why fidelity to the original design was so important?" Harold nodded slowly. "He said the organ was part of a promise made long before his time, something his grandfather failed to honor. Restoring it properly was a way to set things right." Miss Marple's knitting needles gave a single soft click. "Atonement," she murmured. "How interesting." The Reverend crossed himself unconsciously. But what promise could possibly require murder to conceal? Miss Marple did not answer immediately. She allowed silence to stretch, drawing focus back to the core question what the letter contained. Not simply property disputes. No, something older, more binding. Something that had lived in the village longer than the present inhabitants. She looked at the cluster of villagers, their uncertain eyes, their watchful stillness, and beneath that stillness, long memory. And then she said, almost gently, as if stating something perfectly ordinary, "It will be something that ties at least two families together. Something one could build a reputation upon or ruin one with. Perhaps a child placed under another family's care, or a promise regarding land in exchange for silence. Old secrets in villages are rarely terribly original. They are only terribly painful." Someone near the back let out a small, involuntary sound. Not loud, not dramatic, but unmistakably the sound of someone who had just been struck by truth. Miss Marple did not look toward them. Instead, she picked up her knitting again, fingers moving with delicate ease. "Inspector," she said, "I believe the next step is simple. We must look not for who benefited from Mr. Selby's planned revelation, but who feared it most. And fear, as we saw today, is always closest to breaking." Her eyes remained on her, knitting, but her words fell with striking clarity. The murderer is not someone cruel, not someone violent by nature, simply someone who could not allow the past to return. Someone who believed quite sincerely that they were protecting others from harm. A few villagers exchanged glances, unsteady. Clara Hensworth's breathing hitched. Arthur Pritchard's jaw clenched. Samuel Pierce bowed his head in grief, and one person sat perfectly still. Too still. Miss Marple noticed, and said nothing. Not yet. The hush in the hall did not lift. It settled deeper, like mist on a winter field. People shifted in their chairs, not speaking, not daring to look directly at one another. When truth begins to stir in a small village, it makes the air feel close. Detective Harrow dismissed the group with the practical efficiency of a man trying to keep panic at bay. Statements would be taken individually. Everyone was to remain in Elmswood. No travel, no late-night errands. The villagers nodded in solemn, obedient silence. They had been raised to follow instructions spoken in the church hall. They began to file out. Miss Marple rose with them, her movements unhurried. She walked toward the door alongside Clara Hensworth, who held her shawl wrapped too tightly around her shoulders. Clara's eyes looked heavy, like a woman who had not slept in years rather than hours. Outside, the fading afternoon sky lay pale blue over the village green. Leaves rustled, and the smell of damp stone surrounded them. "Miss Marple?" Clara's voice broke before she had formed a full sentence. "Yes, dear." "It wasn't Arthur," she whispered, barely audible. "Whatever people say about their argument, Arthur wouldn't harm anyone. He's hot-tempered, yes, but not wicked. I know him. I've known him since we were children." Miss Marple patted Clara's arm gently. "I never suspected Arthur of wickedness. Anger and cruelty are not the same, and passion, in its own way, is honest." Clara blinked rapidly, tears beginning to form. "But lies," Miss Marple continued softly, "lie quietly. They do not draw attention. That is why they are dangerous." Clara paused mid-step, her breath caught in her chest. For a moment, it seemed she might speak, truly speak. But then she looked toward the row of cottages, where lamplight was beginning to appear in warm squares behind window glass. A quiet, ordinary scene, one the village needed desperately to protect. She swallowed her confession. "I should go home," she murmured. "My husband will worry." And she hurried away. Miss Marple watched her go. Not Clara, then not directly, but Clara was afraid for someone close. Harrow approached across the green, coat collar turned up against the gathering chill. "You saw something," he said, "in there." When the talk of family secrets came up, Miss Marple did not deny it. "Yes, and?" he prompted, though with the resigned tone of a man who already knew she would not give him the answer plainly. "It is not time to confront anyone," Miss Marple replied. "We are still missing one piece, the letter. Without it, we understand only motives, not actions." Harrow exhaled, frustrated. "And you believe the letter is still in the church?" "Oh, not in the church," Miss Marple said lightly, as though commenting on a weather matter. "No murderer would hide something in the very place they'd just stained with violence. Too obvious, too near." She looked toward the churchyard instead, the stone wall, the row of yews, the old graves where the earth had shifted unevenly through years of freeze and thaw. "Panic makes the hands move quickly," she continued, "and quickly placed things rarely go far." Harrow followed her gaze. "The churchyard." Miss Marple nodded once. They crossed the grass together, moving slowly so as not to draw notice from the lingering villagers. Thinned into the cool gray of twilight. Birds settled into their roosts with soft, rustling sounds. They reached the organist's entrance at the back of the church, where a small stone bench sat beside the path. The earth nearby was damp from morning dew. Miss Marple crouched not with strain or awkwardness, but with the practiced grace of someone who had knelt beside flower beds all her life. Her fingers brushed the soil. Disturbed. Recently. Not deeply. Just enough to tuck something flat beneath a stone. Harrow knelt beside her and carefully lifted the flat piece of slate resting near the bench leg. Below it, wrapped in oilcloth, was something folded, deliberate, hasty, not hidden by someone who wanted it gone, hidden by someone who hoped terrified that it could be retrieved later. Harrow stared. Dear Lord. Miss Marple did not reach for it. She simply sat back on her heels and sighed a quiet, sad sound. "You see," she said softly. It was never the content of the letter that frightened our killer. It was the memory of it. Whatever is written there, they already knew. A voice broke the quiet behind them. I didn't mean to kill him. They turned. Someone stood just beyond the path, the one who had sat too still, the one Miss Marple had noticed, but not named. Their hands were shaking not with fear for themselves, but fear of what had already been done. Miss Marple rose calmly, shawl settling around her shoulders like a soft mantle. I know, she said. Clara Hensworth stood at the edge of the path, her shawl drawn around her as though it were the only thing holding her upright. The twilight dimmed her features, but her eyes were unmistakably red and raw. She had come back not to confess, Miss Marple thought, but because she could no longer bear the weight of silence. Harrow straightened, letter still in his hand. "Mrs. Hensworth," he said, slowly, carefully. "You understand the seriousness of what you've just said." Clara nodded, though her breath trembled. "I didn't mean to kill him," she repeated, voice thin, fraying at the edges. "I only meant to stop him. Just stop him." Miss Marple walked toward her, not quickly, not dramatically, simply with the steady gentleness of someone approaching a frightened bird. Clara's shoulders sagged in relief and despair, both. "Tell us," Miss Marple said. "If you are to speak, tell us properly." Clara's hands twisted in her shawl, and when she spoke, the words came slowly, spilling from years of quiet fear. "It began months ago," she whispered. "When the restoration started, Edgar Selby was at the church every day, more than the Reverend, more than anyone. He said he was honoring a promise to his family, but then he found the letter, and after he read it, everything changed." She swallowed hard. "He came to my house that very evening," he said. "The letter proved that the land our cottage is built on my cottage, my grandmother's cottage, never rightfully belonged to us, that it was meant to be returned to the Selby family generations ago, that the deed was a forgery, that we had no rightful claim." Her voice broke. "We would have nowhere to go. My husband is ill. We have no savings, no family to take us in. We would be ruined." Harrow's face softened, not in excuse, but in understanding. The most dangerous crimes often grow from the most desperate corners. Clara pressed on. "I begged him not to reveal it. I begged him to leave things as they were. He said he was sorry, but that he had to make things right. That people suffered because of that lie, even if we never knew it." Her knees buckled slightly, and Miss Marple steadied her with a hand. "So I went to the church," Clara continued. "During the luncheon, I knew he'd be there. I only wanted to reason with him again, to plead once more." Voice tightened to a thin whisper. "We argued. He grew angry. I grabbed his arm, and he pulled away. I didn't even realize I'd taken the letter from him. It was in my hand when he stumbled." She closed her eyes. "He fell against the organ bench. I truly thought it was only a fall, but when he didn't move," her voice dissolved. "I panicked. I thought no one would believe me. They would think I struck him. And when I saw the chalk on the keys, on his hands, I don't know what I thought. Just that if the blame could fall elsewhere just long enough for us to sort it." Her hands covered her face. "I hid the letter. Here. I didn't know what else to do." Silence settled once more, this time deeper, sadder. Miss Marple rested her hand lightly over Clara's, not comforting the act, only the human suffering behind it. "My dear," she said softly, "there are some tragedies in life that are not born of malice, but of fear. And fear is a very old companion in villages like ours." Clara's tears fell freely now, dripping into the dark grass. Harrow exhaled slowly, the weight of duty heavy on his shoulders. "Clara Hensworth," he said, voice steady but not unkind, "you will need to come with me." Clara nodded. She did not resist. As Harrow guided her gently away, Miss Marple remained near the bench, the twilight dim around her. She looked toward the organ spire rising in the fading sky. Not triumph, not satisfaction. A quiet, sorrowful recognition. People rarely commit terrible acts because they are terrible, but because they see no other way. And that, Miss Marple thought, was the true tragedy of human nature. The village did not sleep that night. Lamps burned behind curtains late into the small hours, and the lane stayed strangely quiet, as if even the wind were listening for footsteps. News of Clara's confession spread quickly, though no one spoke of it loudly. Whisper. Miss Marple walked home at her usual unhurried pace, shawl tucked closely around her shoulders to keep off the chill. She paused once near the church gate, looking back at the organ spire rising into the dark, a simple silhouette in night air. And yet, beneath its familiar shape, lives had come undone. The next morning dawned pale and cold, as if the sky itself were reluctant to wake. Miss Marple arrived at Street Mildred's early, as she often did, and found Reverend Pemberton inside the nearly silent nave. He was sitting at the first pew, hands folded before him, staring at the organ with a look of deep grief. "It should be a place of sanctuary," he murmured as she approached. "A place where the truth comforts, not wounds." Miss Marple sat beside him. Her voice, when she spoke, was soft. "The truth does not choose its usefulness, Reverend. It merely exists. It is we who decide what to do with it." He let out a weary sigh, the kind that seemed to come from very far back in his life. "I officiated Clara's wedding, you know. A happy day, sunlight everywhere. And now," Miss Marple placed her hand gently over his, "Clara is not a murderer by intention," she said. "She acted in panic. The law must still address what has happened, but the heart may recognize nuance, even where justice cannot." The Reverend closed his eyes in a slow nod. The church doors opened behind them, footsteps echoing softly. Detective Harrow entered, coat buttoned tight, face drawn but not with confusion now, with certainty. "We've read the letter," he said quietly. Miss Marple turned to him, though she already understood the shape of what it would contain. "It was written by Edgar Selby's grandfather," Harrow continued. "During the war, he promised Selby land in exchange for protection of an orphaned child from another family, a child who was never to know where they came from, a child who grew up believing the home they lived in was rightfully theirs." He paused. "That child was Clara's grandmother." Miss Marple nodded once, as though acknowledging a lesson completed. "The Selby family believed they had been wronged," Harrow went on. "And Clara's family believed the land was theirs by birth. Both sides were telling the truth, only different halves of it." Reverend Pemberton whispered, "So no one lied?" "No," Miss Marple said softly. "Only time rearranged the story." Harrow's expression deepened, not grim, not resolved, but quietly burdened. "We will not press for the harshest sentencing," he said, "given the circumstances. But a death did occur, and it was caused by her actions. She must face that." Miss Marple's eyes lowered to her folded hands. "Yes," she said, "consequences remain, even when intentions were rooted in fear." The organ pipes gleamed faintly in morning light, tall and silent. After a moment, Harrow spoke again, more quietly. "There's one more thing." He hesitated not from doubt, but because he recognized the delicate nature of the moment. "You knew it was Clara long before her confession. You saw something the rest of us didn't." Miss Marple smiled very gently. "One grows familiar with patterns of behavior when one lives in a village for as long as I have. The guiltiest person in the room is rarely the loudest, nor the angriest, nor the one defending themselves. It is the one who sits too still, who wishes above all to vanish." Harrow breathed out, a slow release of tension. "You make it look simple." "Oh, no," Miss Marple said kindly. "Human nature is never simple, but it is remarkably consistent." The church bells began to ring. slow and measured, calling the village to morning service. People would come, as they always did. They would sit in their familiar pews. They would sing gentle hymns beneath the same organ pipes where a man had died. And life, quietly, imperfectly, would continue. Miss Marple rose, smoothing her shawl, and walked toward her seat. She did not solve mysteries for praise, nor for triumph. She solved them because understanding the darkness in people allowed her to continue believing in their light. The pews slowly filled, though the usual warmth was missing. Conversations were hushed, movements subdued. Some villagers glanced toward the organ with unease. Others studied the faces around them, wondering how well they truly knew their neighbors. Grief had come to Elmswood not like a storm, but like a quiet, settling frost. Miss Marple sat midway down the left aisle, her hands resting lightly in her lap. She was not watching the altar or the reverend preparing the service. She was watching the people. For though the case had found its shape, the truth had yet to settle. Clara had confessed, but confessions, Miss Marple knew. Beginning. Reverend Pemberton began the opening prayer. His voice, normally steady, wavered. It was not weakness. It was sorrow carried too long without rest. As he spoke, Miss Marple's attention drifted to Arthur Pritchard. He sat rigid in his seat near the aisle, jaw clenched tightly, not in guilt, no, but in anguish. His eyes were fixed on the empty space where Clara usually sat beside her husband. Arthur's hands were fists. He had always been protective of Clara, too protective, perhaps, yet he had said nothing. When the hymn began, Samuel Pierce took his place at the organ. His hands hovered over the keys, as though unsure they deserved to touch them. The first notes trembled before finding their tone soft, searching, wounded. It was a hymn of peace. Perhaps that was why the quiet disruption was so noticeable. Arthur rose abruptly from his seat and stepped out into the aisle. His steps were stiff, almost mechanical, as though something inside him had given way. He did not then walk toward the door, as someone overwhelmed might do. He walked toward the front, toward the organ. Samuel saw him approaching and froze mid-note, hands suspended over the keys. The hymn faltered, then failed entirely. Murmurs rippled through the church. Reverend Pemberton paused mid-sermon line. "Arthur?" he asked gently. "My son, what is it?" Arthur did not answer. He moved to the organ bench, where Samuel sat helplessly waiting, and reached beneath it into the same hinge compartment where Harold had spoken of repairs. His hand emerged holding something. Not the letter. A key. An old iron key, blackened with age. Miss Marple stood not in alarm, but in quiet confirmation. She had suspected there was one more piece. Arthur turned to face the congregation. His expression stripped of all pretense, only raw, exposed history remained. "My family knew," he said, voice rough. "We knew the letter existed, that our land, our standing, our name was built on a promise we did not keep." A ripple of shock swept through the church. "My grandfather hid the letter," Arthur continued, "to protect the Pritchards. And when Edgar Selby started looking into the church records during the Restoration, I realized he must have found something. I followed him. I watched. I knew what was coming." His breath shook as he looked toward the pew where Clara should have been. "I was ready to take the blame," he whispered. "If it saved her. She didn't kill him. Not truly. I was the one who—" Miss Marple stepped forward then, the soft tap of her shoes the only sound. "No, Arthur," she said gently. "You were prepared to sacrifice yourself. That is not the same as guilt." Arthur's shoulders trembled. "I'd have given anything to protect her." "I know," Miss Marple replied, "which is why you didn't intervene with words but with silence. Yet silence can be as heavy as any stone." The Reverend came to stand beside them. his voice quiet. "The key, Arthur. What does it open?" Arthur looked down at it, a relic of old wrongs, old loyalties, old debts. "It opens a box," he said, "a box hidden in the rectory attic. My grandfather put it there. Inside were deeds, notes, proof of the agreement. He meant to return the land, but he never did. And I continued the lie by saying nothing." The congregation listened, not with anger, but with a weary understanding. Elmswood had always been a place where history lived inside the walls. Samuel's voice broke the silence. Then Clara never needed to plead with Selby at all. The truth was already waiting to be acknowledged. And Edgar Selby, Miss Marple added softly, was trying to do just that. Not to punish, only to restore. Arthur closed his eyes, tears rising, not loud grief, but silent, exhausted sorrow. Miss Marple placed a hand on his arm. The village must now decide how to mend what has been broken. The law will handle Clara's actions. But the rest, the history, the inheritance of guilt and grace, belongs to the living. The church remained still, not peaceful, but beginning, gently, to breathe again. The congregation did not disperse immediately. They remained seated, as though rising would break something fragile that had only just begun to settle. The stillness in the church felt solemn, not oppressive, like a long-buried truth had finally taken a breath after years underground. Reverend Pemberton bowed his head in quiet prayer, but there were few words spoken aloud. Some truths require silence to be absorbed. Miss Marple remained standing beside Arthur, her presence a quiet anchor. Arthur held the key loosely now, as if it no longer weighed as much as it once had, but his shoulders sagged, the burden of memory heavier than the metal ever had been. Detective Harrow stepped forward at last, speaking with care rather than authority. "Arthur, you'll need to give your statement formally," he said. "But this," his gaze touched the key, "is not a matter of criminal guilt. It is the legacy of an old deception, a village wound." Arthur nodded faintly, tears drying without being wiped away. The admission had exhausted him, but it had also eased something that had resisted ease for years. Samuel Pierce rose from the organ bench, stepping quietly to Arthur's side. He did not touch him, but the proximity itself was a gesture of forgiveness. "No hymn today," Samuel murmured. "Not yet." His voice was steady again. Music, perhaps, would return in time. Villagers began to stand slowly, thoughtfully. They moved like people seeing one another anew. Neighbors who had known each other for decades regarded one another not with suspicion, but with a solemn, shared understanding. Clara's husband, Mr. Hensworth, had arrived at the doorway, drawn by word, by instinct, by fear. He looked years older than he had the day before. Miss Marple walked to him, gently. "She does not need blame now," she said softly. "Only companionship." His eyes filled with grief, but he nodded. "I will go to her." "Good," Miss Marple said. "She will not speak of her guilt to anyone else, but she will speak to you." He left the church at once. Harrow turned to Miss Marple. "There's still the matter of the deeds," he said quietly. "The land will have to be restored, ownership reestablished. It may mean moving families, changing boundaries. There will be dispute." "Oh, certainly," Miss Marple replied, drawing her shawl closer as though bracing against a small wind. "But disputes are far less dangerous once truth has been aired. It's secrets that turn quarrels into tragedies." Harrow exhaled, a weary sort of agreement. "You make it sound like this happens often." "It does," Miss Marple said gently. "In every village, in every family. The past is never quite past. It lives in us, whether we invite it to or not." Harrow smiled then, not a cheerful thing, but a genuine one. "You know," he said, "if you ever wanted to consult for the police." She waved a hand lightly. "My dear Inspector, I retired from all useful seriousness decades ago. I merely pay attention." Harrow chuckled under his breath. Outside, the morning sunlight brightened the churchyard, thin and cool. Villagers stepped out into it slowly, some pausing at the gate, looking up at the organ spire with a mixture of reverence and grief. Miss Marple walked home along the familiar lane, the earth soft beneath her shoes. She passed the garden walls, the hedges trimmed neatly, the chimney smoke rising in gentle plumes. Life here did not move in great strokes, but small, careful steps. As she reached her garden gate, she paused not from fatigue, but reflection. She had seen many tragedies in her life, some born of jealousy, or hatred, or greed, desperate fear of losing something precious. Those, she thought, were the saddest of all. She pushed open her gate and stepped inside. The village behind her continued its mourning, touched but not broken, and Miss Marple, with a soft sigh and a small, thoughtful smile, went inside to make tea. The kettle began to hum just as Miss Marple settled into her small sitting room, her favorite chair angled toward the garden window. The roses outside were beginning their winter retreat, petals thinning, stems withdrawing into themselves. Life, she thought, always moved in these quiet, rhythmic cycles. Growth, bloom, retreat, rest. Villages, too. She poured the hot water over the tea leaves and let them steep, her hands steady though her mind remained active. Cases did not simply end when a culprit confessed. Lives continued to change after the final word was spoken. She had only taken her first sip when she heard the soft creak of her front gate. Not hurried, not hesitant. Familiar footsteps. Detective Harrow appeared in her doorway a moment later, removing his hat as though he were entering a church. "Miss Marple," he said quietly, "may I come in?" "Of course," she replied, gesturing toward the small table. "There is tea enough for two." He sat, though he did not immediately drink. His eyes were thoughtful, troubled not with confusion now, but with the weight of what must follow. "I've spoken to Clara," he said. "She understands the situation. There will be a magistrate's inquiry. Given her intent and her state of mind, there may be leniency, but there will still be consequence." Miss Marple nodded. "There always is. Even forgiveness does not erase the path taken to reach it." Harrow looked toward the window, where pale sunlight touched the rim of the teacup. "The villagers are already choosing sides," he murmured. "Some believe Edgar Selby should not have disturbed the past. Others say the truth was his duty, and some he hesitated. Some blame you, Miss Marple, for seeing what they would have preferred remained unseen." Miss Marple smiled faintly, not unkindly. "That is the way of things. When one removes a stone from a wall, people are less upset about the hole left behind than the draft that comes through it. But walls must breathe, or they crumble." Harrow huffed a quiet breath, half a sigh, half a reluctant laugh. "There's something else," he said finally. "We opened the box Arthur mentioned. The old deeds, the correspondence, the records, it's all there. Enough to restore the original land arrangement, enough to set the history right, legally. But," Miss Marple prompted gently. "But," Harrow echoed, "there is also a ledger, written in Clara's grandmother's hand. Very clear, very detailed." His voice lowered. She knew the land was not hers. She simply chose never to say it, and the village built its life around that silence. Miss Marple stirred her tea once, slowly. "Yes," she said. "I had wondered about that. Secrets do not survive 3 generations unless someone nourishes them." "Do we reveal it?" Harrow asked. "Not as an officer of the law, as a man." Miss Marple's gaze drifted to the garden where the last rose petal loosened and fell. "Not yet," she said softly. "Clara's burden is heavy enough. The village must settle before it receives another wound. Truth is necessary, but timing is the difference between healing and harm. Harrow nodded, shoulders easing. He had known the answer, but needed it spoken. He stood, finishing his tea, with a quiet respect. "You see people far too clearly," he said. "It must be a lonely gift." Miss Marple smiled, her expression warm and infinitely kind. "Oh no," she said. "Understanding people is how one remains never alone." Harrow left, the gate closing softly behind him. The house was quiet once more. Miss Marple returned to her chair, knitting needles in hand, not to distract her thoughts, but to settle them. The wool moved smoothly between her fingers, her gaze softening. Outside, the church bell rang again, not morning now, but marking the hour. Life in Elmswood continued. Wounded, yes, but still living. And that, Miss Marple thought, was the closest thing to peace that people ever truly receive. The village of Elmswood settled slowly into its new shape, as if the world were gently rebuttoning itself after being shaken loose. Time moved with a softer step. People spoke more quietly to one another, yet with a deeper attention than before. No one pretended to have been untouched. Clara remained in custody pending the inquest, though the tone of the village's conversations about her was not angry. It was tender, sorrowful. She received visitors each evening, Arthur among them, who sat with her in still companionship. Her actions had caused death, yes, but they had not come from cruelty. The village understood that now. Mr. Hensworth took to visiting Reverend Pemberton often. The two men would sit in the vestry, speaking low and slow, as though rebuilding something carefully between them. Samuel Pierce continued the hymns, though he played more quietly now, with a gentleness that felt like apology. The land dispute, when it came before the parish council, was handled not with uproar but with something like mutual recognition. Arthur and Mr. Hensworth both insisted that no one be forced from a home. A new kind of agreement was drafted, one that honored both families without undoing lives. It was not perfect, but it was human. On a cool afternoon, a week later, Miss Marple received a visitor. Arthur stood at her gate, hat in hand, eyes less haunted than before, but still shadowed at the edges. She brought him inside without a word and poured tea. "I wanted to thank you," he said quietly. "If you hadn't understood, if you hadn't guided things as you did, Clara might have been painted a monster." Miss Marple smiled gently. "She was frightened, Arthur, and fear can make even gentle souls dangerous if cornered long enough." Arthur nodded, looking down at his hands. "There's something else," he said. "I keep thinking about Selby, about why he pushed so hard to bring the letter to light, why he insisted on restoring the organ, why he chose that moment, that service, to reveal everything." "Because," she said softly, "Edgar Selby did not act from pride, nor revenge. He believed he was making amends. He believed he was healing something broken long before any of us were born." Arthur swallowed. "And instead, it caused—" "Yes," Miss Marple murmured. "But healing often requires wounds to be opened first. Edgar Selby did not die for ruin. He died in the first stirrings of repair." A long silence settled between them, the kind that holds truth gently, without forcing it into shape. When Arthur finally rose to leave, his shoulders were straighter, not unburdened, but steadier beneath the weight. Miss Marple returned to her window seat after he left, her knitting resting loosely in her lap. Outside, the last chill of winter clung to the air, but the earliest buds of spring already pressed at the edges of the hedges. Small signs, quiet beginnings. She had seen many endings in her life, but endings, she knew, were rarely endings at all. They were pauses, breaths, before the next thread was taken up. She glanced toward the church spire rising just visible beyond the rooftops. The organ would play again next Sunday. The villagers would gather again. They would speak softly of the past, but their hands would be busy with the business of living. Human nature, Miss Marple murmured to the empty room, is very seldom dramatic. It is simply enduring. She lifted her knitting needles and began again, the wool moving smoothly, the pattern unfolding. Outside, Elmswood carried on quiet, imperfect, and very much alive, and Miss Marple smiled, content not with the mystery solved, but with the world once again understood.